I'm Reid. I'm a printmaker in Los Angeles, and this is my father, James Reid, a master printmaker of close to 40 years, also lives in Los Angeles. I've been a printmaker for quite a big chunk of my life, but I left Los Angeles and went to the Pacific Northwest up in Portland, Oregon to get my undergrad degree. And while I was there, I considered studying printmaking, but realized that was foolish when I could learn it from my father. And so I studied sculpture instead. And after college, moved back to Los Angeles to start working as a printmaker at Gemini Gel. I feel like I do a lot of fairly abstracted gestural work that's surrounded by the idea of mountains. I have no idea where my fascination with mountains came from. Maybe it's the fact that I never see them living in Los Angeles, but I know they're out there.
I'm James Reid. I moved to Los Angeles in 1979 after studying lithography from one of the early printmaking programs in Vancouver under Bob Evermann. I worked at Gemini since 1979. I had the great opportunity to work with 20 of the major artists of our time. Rachel was mentioning that she was doing work early. I would say when she was probably 6 or 7 years old, she would come into the shop on the weekends and we would do work. So she has a long experience in a print shop.
This I'm setting up, preparing the paper to be printed. We have a punch system of registration, and so I'm putting on these strips to protect the paper. This is very old paper that I'm using actually, so it's been burned around the edges, but that will not affect my final printing. So I'm taking this thin plastic strip that will punch holes through, and it'll keep the paper perfectly aligned with my image through multiple passes.
The registration pins here establish a consistent positioning for the paper and the relationship of the image on the paper. Especially when you have multiple runs, that allows all of the image pieces to be perfectly registered.
I'm using two different kinds of papers today. This is a handmade Japanese gampi, so I'm using both Eastern and Western papers. This one right here is Arches BFK. And different papers give you different effects to how it takes the printing elements. The surface of this paper, it's much thinner, takes dings quite easily, but it's much smoother, so it'll take the ink without offering any embossment and surface texture. Whereas the Western paper, there is a little bit more of a mesh when it was made.
Lithography really went through a resurgence in the 60s, and there was very little knowledgeable people in the United States being able to do fine art lithography. And there was a school set up in Los Angeles under June Wayne to reintroduce printmaking, specifically lithography, to younger artists who then went on to be instructors. Bob Evermann was one of the early graduates of that program, and when he moved to Vancouver, I enrolled in his class and I learned lithography through him. It was a time when printmaking was really getting a whole new start, and then those people went on to different schools and became the teachers, professors of those programs.
This is the original drawing that I made. It's a toner wash drawing on Mylar, and the way that I like to make my work is in inverse. And so everywhere where I've drawn really dark, heavy black, I shoot it onto a negative plate, so it eventually will become white in those areas and black in the positive areas. This was an early proof that I had made from this drawing, from the plate we're going to show in a moment. And I attempted it just in black to see what it looked like, and I felt like the color was too harsh and too aggressive, and I wanted some softer tones, so that's where today we're going to be printing in blue. So I'm removing the image from the ruby, and this ruby, it blocks out UV lights, and so my original drawing was rather haphazard, and I wanted a crisp, clean edge, so I cut this so that it would be a crisp, clean edge. But when I shot it, I have to shoot. This is the way the drawing was drawn, but if I want my final print to look like this in this orientation, I have to flip my drawing over so that as it's inked and pulled off on a piece of paper, the image would be correct reading again. So as you can see, this fits the drawing quite well, and it was shot leaving my printing matrix, which is a mirror image version of my drawing. And not only is it a mirror image, it's also an inverse negative image of my drawing.
So the plate starts off and it's got this kind of greeny blue color that's a photopolymer photoemulsion that covers the entire plate. And when the image is put in a vacuum table to make contact with this, the ultraviolet light strikes the areas on a negative plate. It will strike the non-image areas, and they will eventually be washed away. In a positive plate, it's the opposite of that.
So at this point, I'm going to start rolling up my slab, and I'll start with a very lean amount of ink. And you want to start really lean at first so that you don't blow out your image when you're printing and laying the ink down. So a lot of printmaking, it's done by sight, but it's also done by feel and by listening to the ink. So at this point, I'm smoothing it out, getting it evenly on the roller. I can tell you have to have a good upper body strength to be able to do this.
The blue material that's on the plate that is the image is grease receptive, and the non-image areas are not grease receptive under most circumstances. And so actually use a very diluted version of lithotrene, which is a solvent, and the water, and that takes all of the protective coating that was on the plate away. As long as the plate stays wet, the ink will only attach itself to the blue areas. And so I'm keeping the plate damp but not wet, and Rachel will then roll the ink onto the plate a number of times, very slowly building up the ink layer on the plate. But there's a very brief period where the plate moisture condition is exactly right. You can see how the ink now is attached. Now if she were to stay on there just a little bit longer, the ink would start spreading everywhere. So you can see, like at this end here, there's a lot of more sort of purple looking, but over on the sides where there hasn't been enough rolling, there's you still see a lot of the emulsion. And when I'm sponging, I have to keep it wet enough so that the ink won't attach itself, but also dry enough so I don't leave any streaks. And you can see there's some streaks in there as starts up in the beginning, so I can spread the ink around a little bit just to get the ink to lay down more evenly.
Don't know if I can get one of these in there.
One more pass and then
yeah.
Oh yeah, that looks nice. Very nice. The basics of lithography is that grease and water don't mix. So the gum arabic is water soluble and the ink is solvent soluble. So as long as those two elements are kept in check, the image, the ink will only attach itself to the image area where you want it to attach. You see, there's a real relationship here between the printer and the assistant. I'm trying to keep the plate just moist enough so it's accepting ink, and at the same time be ready for the printer to come forward. So we have a couple of passes on this now.
Oh, should we put another one on? Just one's fine.
pressure that's being applied onto the plate here is between this very thin piece of white plastic and the plate itself. And the white plastic is called a scraper bar. And it has a width of about 1/4 of an inch or 3/16 of an inch. And that's putting directly pressure just on that one section as it goes through the press.
Your first print should be what's referred to as salty, where the solid areas are still fairly light and fairly lean. And then some of these tonal areas, I've just barely brought them up, getting them to where I want them.
I'm extremely proud of Rachel. She has a very positive attitude. She has very creative problem-solving skills, and I would love to take credit for that, but somewhere it's come into the world through her.
So I'll reuse this for the remaining of the editions. Just pop them off the pins. Throughout the years, I would do summer internships with my father. He probably had people that could do the project, but he was always accepting of me to come in to the studio and for him to teach me lithography through his eyes, as well as unload all of his secrets that lithographers hold onto me. So these are the first two impressions pulled off of the plate on real paper. And there's some pretty significant differences between the two of them and the adjustments I had to make from this one being the first and this being the second print. And you can look up pretty close and from afar that this overall sort of has a really flat feeling to it, where the areas that are supposed to be rich and dark are not there yet, and the areas that are sort of lean and tonal are there yet. So this was a good sign, and it's always best to start in lithography with very lean slabs and build up the layers as much as you can, build up the ink layer. And so over here, if you inspect a corner here, it's what we refer to as salty, and it's where the whites of the paper are showing through the ink, and so it literally looks salty. By the second impression, the only adjustment I did was just add a little bit more ink to my slab and one more pass, and that made this world of difference.